The Cuyar-Chirivel corridor is a natural passage connecting the Levantine and Murcian orchards with the Penivetica highlands. Sierra de María and Orce to the north and Sierra de las Estancias to the south delimit the well-known corridor whose waters transport the Rambla de Chirivel towards the Segura Basin. The traffic is evident that it continues over so many years, as we are able to simply imagine, because from our glance we can go back or we can go forward. That is, we can walk through that corridor where we see the accumulated vestiges of the past, and we can go back to try to talk to those vestiges with those remains and with those societies that were already there before us, stepping on and eating from this territory. I think the continuity of transits in time is evident in such a way that a quick glance at the speed of light would make us think that time does not exist. Communities have settled in its surroundings from prehistory to the present day. The oldest evidence and tools are preserved at the Miguel Guirao Museum, the Miguel Guirao Museum. It collects that history of the past, of a corridor as busy as the Chirivel-Belarubio axis. But really that history that the museum preserves today is dispersed in the territory and is capable of showing us and defining areas of transit that come beyond the Paleolithic. As has been able to demonstrate in the axis of Rambla de Chirivel deposits from the Monsterian stage, some with more recent evidence of the Upper Planolithic, and above all a great demographic explosion that is evident in the occupation that occurs in the age of copper. Above the Neolithic sites of the Chirivel corridor, an axis appears that vertebrae and also organizes traffic along the entire route of that axis. It is still alive, it is still active, and it is still busy in the Bronze Age. There is a change in the settlement pattern. The copper deposits are in the small hills, They are height close to the resources of agriculture and water. After the Bronze, well, we reach that dispersed end of the final Bronze with the Iron Age and the appearance of, with writing and the new occupations that also have to do with the transit, and they have to do with the axis. And let's also take into account that it has an accumulated factor. This transit axis becomes a border, and is a border with the Levantine world in ancient prehistoric times, and is a border systematic that today we can see crystallized in the fortifications that remain from the Middle Ages. Not that border that can be seen there and that today is maintained with the province of Murcia, with this entrance to Andalusia. I believe that it certainly certifies that the corridor that occupies us of Verrubio, Chirivel, which was really the entrance to Andalusia, archaeologists and historians agree that the ancient Roman road between Heliocroca and Basti passed through the current municipalities of Velezrubio, Chirivel, and Cuyar. At the time of transition to year zero of our era, transportation had continued through the corridor. Evidence of these very consolidated characteristics, since they are the transits of those Roman roads, the itinerary that linked from Lorca to Baza, passing through hedgerow lands, both the Rubio, Chirivel, and Cuya, which united these towns, and which therefore allowed a new leap in the great generation. Of the wealth of the Roman Empire itself, communication routes were as fundamental as they are today. That is why Rome reached as far as we know, and in that passage through Velezano lands we find the site of El Villar in Chirivel, a small Roman villa perfectly adapted, acclimatized and decorated. With the presence of those mosaics that have their galleries, the peristyle that made up the house, where surprisingly in 1985 an archaeological excavation brought us a great discovery, the appearance of a sculptural piece in perfect condition that had been buried to safeguard it from the passage of time. And that Dionysus looked at us, who is today preserved in the Almería Museum and who has his replica and therefore accessible to view on Paseo de Chirivel itself. The impact of the discovery of this Roman sculpture was great for the municipality itself. In fact, Chirivel identified himself with this great discovery in such a way that it transcended between his imagination and his own toponymy, not in such a way that the Dionysus became the Chirivelero due to the arrangement of watchtowers and fortresses such as the Castellón. It is very likely that the plains and channels of the current Rambla de Chirivel served as a communication route for people and cavalry. The first major works to build a public road date back to the second half of the 18th century during the reign of Charles III. The first roads to be built are those known as royal roads. These royal roads were indeed an innovation representative of the enlightened Spanish monarchy of the 18th century. Precisely the design of the first royal road between Lorca and Baza was the responsibility of the famous abbot of Baza, who had previously been a priest here in Vélez Rubio, Antonio José Navarro, who was commissioned by Florida Blanca, who was a minister, Charles III, is entrusted with the design and execution of that royal road, the terrain being rough and uneven. With a crowd of ravines, it would be necessary to drive it over a row of bridges and sewers by force of cuts and recesses in the terrain, with embankments in many places. On the one hand, the Rambla has its margins of avenues planted almost without interruption, orchards and irrigation land. From the old and disappeared Camino Real, we have some evidence left, place names. Food and rest spots like Venta La Petra, Venta Piccolo, Venta Quemada, Venta del Peral, etc. remain. Posadas, Chirivel, Rosario, Marques, etc. Plaque of the old gate of Granada, names of roads, Camino Real, Camino de Lorca, Calle Real, etc. Cortijo de la Media Legua. Today, some of those elements are still preserved. Naturally, there are no factory works because there used to be no major works, but some of the toponymy, the name of the sales is preserved, the name of Camino Real. Another policy, for example, preserves the oval, the famous oval, which was like a modern roundabout, the place where several roads converged, right? The geographical space that we know today as the Chirivel-Vélez corridor has always had a constant over time in terms of the paths of people, luggage, passengers, and merchandise. Specifically, in modern times, we have some of the first references to this step. This route was naturally very different from what we know today. But it was still the place of passage, because to go up from the lowlands of Murcia to the highlands of the Peribetica, this was the most appropriate place, the corridor of Chirivel, Los Vélez. The first travelers who visit Andalusia mounted in a vehicle of two wheels, pulled by a horse or a mule, offer us testimonies of the terrible state of the roads. Many of the travelers who come, English, French, Dutch, Italians, all agree in pointing out the difficulties of traveling through this place. There were no real roads. They generally had to go the cart in which they were going, the stagecoach in which they were going. It had to be along a riverbed from the Rambla de Chirivel, or through steppe places around the Contador area, Ventaquemada, etc. From Lumbreras a Vélez Rubio, there are horrible roads. They are made about 5 leagues on the Rambla de Nogalte, having no other perspective than that of the deserts, peeled rocks, and being surrounded by high mountains that soon, in winter, are covered with snow. Stream beds served as roads at midday, and steep arid mountains for the rest. All the travelers, already in the 19th, those known as romantic travelers, agreed to point out in the advances that had been known with the royal roads. But nevertheless, they still speak of deficiencies. They still speak of a certain hardship. For example, they speak of the famous language of the friar. As the friar's tongue ran through the counter area, windblown, Chirivel didn't seem to them that it was enormously tiring, did it? Along with this, we also have to take into account the danger that traveling at those times represented. Many of them they were armed, they went with an escort, with people who defended them in case of danger, and also the difficulty of the inns, that is today. We get in our modern vehicle and go from one place to another without any problem. There are restaurants, inns, hotels, places, rest areas. But in those times, it was very complicated to travel with groceries because they had to be non-perishable, and because in each place, at each sale, they had to stop to stock up on new groceries. Not despite the obvious improvements that these public works entailed. For almost the entire 19th century, travelers would continue to complain about the situation of the road. The path coincides with the bed of a dry river. The banks of the stream are steep in many areas, so much so that in Granada I have been told that in rainy weather it is impossible to travel to Murcia. This implementation of liberal models, which concerns public works and roads, consisted of the state, in the style of what Adam Smith had proposed at the time, having to be in charge of the construction of public works. And that led to the creation of a ministry that was to take charge of that process. It would be created in 1851 and received the name Ministry of Development. And that ministry is going to be the one that is going to be in charge during the 19th century of building roads that already had the name of a road, not a road, although formally. In physical realization, it can still remind us somewhat of those roads. The 19th century route maintained the same route between Veix and Vélez Rubio, but from here it leaves the Vélez or Guadalentín river basin and heads through the then rear of the town, Huertas de las Casas de Carrera del Carmen, towards Puerto Lumbreras. It involved navigating Biota's steep climbs and passing through areas away from the Rambla de Nogante. They were roads that were known as Macadam roads, which had a very peculiar structure, since it consisted of making a more or less solid firm, with stones, with elements of different caliber that allowed a certain stability. All this, it was covered with a receiving layer at the top, with one in the convex shape that the road had. It allowed it to evacuate with a certain effectiveness any waters that existed, and that allowed continuity to the road. Road initiatives primarily stemmed from the general road plan developed in 1860. This 1860 general road plan is reformed in 1864. and again reformed again in 1877. Those are the great road plans of the 19th. How do they affect the Velez region? Well, the one from 1860 proposes a first-order highway, which were the important roads that connected with the state capital and with the main ports. A road, as I say, of the first order between Murcia and Granada. However, the road, let's say, it would lose category in the 1864 plan because it became second order. The factory works and the bridges that mark the road, Cedenojos, Charche, Prato, Canete, etc., come from the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th. This road will begin to be built relatively immediately. But like most of the roads in this area and in a good part of Spain, they will not be completed practically until the 20th century. The construction of the factory works was a crucial element in the realization of these state roads. Basically, what these factory works did was overcome rivers or special difficulties that existed on the ground. On the road we are talking about from Murcia to Granada, in the area around Los Vélez, different bridges, sewers, cuttings, retaining walls were built. What material was used for this type of factory works? Normally the one that was closest to the construction of the road in the environment, temporary quarries were set up, and in this environment logically limestone was mainly used, and limestone will be what will make up most of these factory works in other sites. Given the absence of limestone, what was done is that brick was used. We can find brick on different roads that may catch our attention, such as because of the color it could have, but basically it responded to the absence of a solid stone for this construction. Another important element in the construction of the roads will be the presence, let's say continuous, of pedestrian boxes. These pedestrian boxes, which were normally located every 10, every 15 km at the edge of the road, fulfill the function of surveillance and maintenance. The pedestrian, his family, settled in the area. And in this way, if there was some type of damage on the road, he could repair it, or he could warn if the travelers who traveled along it did not suffer harm. Urban journeys were an especially complex element to carry out in that period. Why? Because a road as such had never crossed cities, for example in Vélez Rubio. Well, we had the Royal Road that entered through the gate of Granada and left through the gate of Lorca and passed through the urban center without major setbacks for the construction of the new road, since we had to look for a step that was more open for the road, because if it was done through the interior, homes had to be expropriated and demolished. Therefore, in this case on the road, in the end, what was done was in the area of the Puerta de San Nicolás to take the step. In Chiribel, it was not even chosen to pass tangentially to the town, but rather passed approximately 500 milliliter north of the town, and today the national highway is in the center of the town. That is, the town was growing, approaching the national highway. The main transport that engineers talk about at that time is Esparta to the port of Águila.
What's the matter?
Which opened in 1885, the construction of the railway through the Almanzora Valley began. That railway that could have passed through here, through the Velez region, but in the end, the Public Works Engineers Report of 1880 ruled that it was more profitable through Almanzora and was more profitable simply through the iron deposits. Freestone is an English gentleman in the style of those of the 19th who took his car, In 1930, with his impressive automobile, Friston chose to explore Spain. He did this tour of Spain on roads that already had not only macadam, but in some cases already had the so-called tar macadam. That is, they were already partly asphalt, partly asphalt. After decades of service and maintenance, bridges have demonstrated their firmness in the face of guided tours and disasters.
The Rambla has come out, they said, in the streets. Even in the grey afternoon, we descended along mud paths. In the October air, you could hear the descent of the waters.
Then we contemplated it from the bridge. Given the shortage of motor vehicles and the intense trees of its ditches, the road, as it passed through the towns, became a pleasant summer walk. And the parapets and works of the factory in hard resting places, those large constructions that then served so many people, so many trips, so many goods, today have been transformed into something very different. Today those roads have been transferred, especially the crossings,
They have been transferred to the municipalities, and the municipalities have been in charge of making great walks with new designs, with new sidewalks, streetlights, benches. But until recently, they have been the place of leisure. They have been the place of walk for many of us, of those of us who are already of a certain age, right? I remember perfectly how the traffic of cars was minimal. It was very little, because it was the meeting place, the place where you walked with the girls with the boys, right? Relationships of a certain sociability were established.
When the work on Highway A92 is planned, it is taken into account that the area was going to cross one very important natural space. It is the base of the Sierra de Maria Natural Park and an area that is historical and since prehistory because it has enormous value. So it is done, and it is considered that there should be an environmental direction that would take it to someone who is an expert in both biology and geology, which was what corresponded to me. This work was one of the first that had a special budget for revegetation, and in revegetation we didn't go looking.
Plants or species that were not from here. We were always studying and analyzing what was in the region, what was in the area where they crossed and settled.
Now, they are very interesting when spring arrives to pass through this section because, for example, in the median area, for example, there are some species like the Iniesta, which has that yellow flower, which is a spectacle to see in spring. Where is the trace made? It is not taken into account if there are archaeological sites, if there are remains. It is not used and used because from the one that from an economic point of view is more viable from an economic and technical point of view. A necropolis, well, it was for a necropolis, the necropolis of Jarea, which is Muslim, because then all the remains were removed, the graves were excavated. I think that this material is preserved in the Almería Museum, and it was in the Piccolo area. That is between the limit of Belrubio and Chiribel. There was a tile shed that, where Arabic tiles are made, but it was until maybe 50 years ago in use. And then what was done was to extract stone. And it was reproduced in the area in a rest area that is right next door. If we now take a bird's eye view, well, what is left? Well, those sections that the highway did not go over. What's the matter? Well, those sections, fortunately, the two best bridges are preserved. We facilitate communication, but at the same time and parallel business, because this was a transit area where people stopped to eat, to fill up gas, typical of one of the towns that lived around the road, perhaps more Chiriver than Vélez Rubio. Well, then all those businesses disappear, and what the highway has done is facilitate modern communications that, fortunately, I don't think we would understand now. In the 21st century, we would not understand that here there would still be a national highway. The highway has improved communications, work has improved, commerce has improved, transportation to go to the university, Granada, Murcia has improved. I mean, we are in the 21st century, yes. It was always done and counted to try to preserve as much as possible. Fortunately, those bridges are preserved. Fortunately, archaeological sites are preserved and safe. But in short, I think that for this region, well, it was a before and an after. Road construction has been an element that has changed totally the economic and social trajectory of the territory. These roads ended up being fully integrated into their environment and are today part of their cultural heritage. Consider a road because it has stopped being used. It is no longer of greater interest. It is surely part of the usual contempt for the past that we tend to have in this society. It is not about preserving everything or preserving for the sake of preserving, but it is about having documented the history of communications, fundamental, I insist, in economic and social development, and above all preserving those elements that are especially significant, such as it may be a bridge or it may be a peculiar layout. Many of those 19th century factory works that we have all known and that we have commonly used until just a few years ago are now, however, part of the service roads of the highway, or roads that lead us to certain towns or to certain estates, certain people's estates. No. However, when we approach it from its base, we can see the enormous monumentality that these buildings have and the great heritage value for which I understand that they must be preserved and must be maintained in the same way as when they were in use, in perfect use. Well, he used to repair any damage he had. Now, in my humble opinion, I believe that the Seven Ojos Bridge, the Zarche Bridge, the number of bridges that still mark the service roads towards Chiribel or towards other places, towards Puerto Lumbreras, I understand that they should be preserved, should be protected, and without a doubt should be established as heritage elements, even of tourist interest. From here, I appeal to many people who do not know these bridges from their base, to see the enormous monumentality and the enormous importance of these constructions.